Morning, Chairperson.
Yes, honorable members, thank you very much.
Good morning,
Let
Chair.
us, yes, Honorable Benji. Honorable members, let me welcome you to this important meeting, the virtual public hearing that is led by the Ad Hoc Committee on Money Bills as mandated by the legislature. On this day, the 5th day of August 2020, during this month, the Women's Month, when we are facing two major pandemics in South Africa and the world, the COVID-19, as well as the gender-based violence against women and children. So I hope some of these programs of the legislature, including the upcoming ones and the planned ones, the programs of the legislature and the entire province, will assist us in fighting against gender-based violence and femicide. We also encourage the voice of men in the fight, because the women have done their best in bringing up the girl children and having programs directed to the capacitation of the girl children. But now the fact remains, otata mabasincedise in the scourge. And also the free public participation of the members, including the members in various institutions. The legislature, women should be capacitated in municipalities, in government departments, in the private sector, and everywhere. We need to capacitate women to stand the mighty times of scourge. Then also, on the other hand, we need to have programs directed to the boy children. I loved the article that was written by one of our own, MPL, Anil Kumar Pillay, apho ethetha kakuhle ngentoba what is expected of us as leaders and the society in the fight against gender-based violence, and also the adherence to the COVID-19 regulations and the advices that we get from time to time from the president, the minister, the premier, the MECs, and even our speaker of the legislature. So, and those few words, honorable members, I welcome you and our guests as well to this public hearing, and I declare this meeting, the public hearing, officially opened. Thank you very much. Let us now take item number 2, the credentials and apologies, and request Advocate Beja and your team to lead us on this item. Advocate. Advocate Beja.
Excuse me, ma'am. This is Miataza here at this end. Advocate Beja is having some challenges regarding her microphone and speaker. She says she can't hear us.
Okay.
Yes.
Carry on, Dr. Miataza.
Okay. But what I can say is that what we have at the moment, we've got Honorable Pongo as part of the meeting, Honorable Keleku. We've got Honorable Odendal, Honorable Luana, and Honorable Camilo Benjamin. Honorable Filtani was having some challenges, but we're trying to connect him. That is, I've asked, that is Mr. Sauli, that is connect him, that is from IT. And then on our guests, we have Dr. Dumisani Gyanjis from the National PBO at the National Parliament. We also have Ms. Msindo, that is from Rhodes University. We have Dr. Mueller from UJ. We also have Honorable Ngondlo, who I think is from the Western Cape, but I will verify that. And we also have Mr. Tlamelo, that is also from Rhodes University. Those are the people who are having at the meeting with us now. Honorable Chair, I think I want to check whether Advocate Beja has managed to connect here. I don't know whether she can, but that's what I have at the moment. Thanks, Chair.
Chair.
Yes, Advocate.
No, it's Honorable
Oh,
Benjamin. Honorable Fultani said on our group that he is in, Chair. So he is in the
Okay.
meeting.
Thank you, Honorable Benji. Thank you, Honorable Benji. So we have UJ, we have Rhodes, we have the third one. Dr.
That is
Miyabonga?
the PBO, that is the National PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, that is the National Assembly.
Yes, Dr.
I still want, there's also Honorable Ngondlo, who's Honorable Ngondlo, that is ANC, but I assume that is from the Western Cape, but I still need to verify that with Advocate Beja. But if
Okay.
maybe the Honorable Member can just maybe announce his or her presence, I think that would also be fine.
Honorable Nkondlo. Honorable Nkondlo.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, colleagues. I'm Member Nkondlo from the Western Cape. I'm in the Finance, Economic Development and Tourism Standing Committee. I'm interested in the process because we are also still at the early stages of a similar process in our legislature. Thank you for also affording me an opportunity to join and learn from your session. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Nkondlo. Thank you that we have one of our guests from another province, and we would love to have seen your face, you know, especially when it's a female face, Mamnobulum Nkondlo. You know, lenyanga yamakhosikazi, we need to be free and be seen and be visible and be heard, you know. Thank you very much. You're welcome. You're welcome. Honorable members, with our guests, I've already welcomed you, our dear guests. So let us proceed to item number 3, the adoption of the agenda. We have the agenda on the screen, the purpose of the meeting that will be following, the submissions on the bill, then the questions for clarity from committee members, then the way forward and closure. I put the agenda, honorable members.
Honorable Camilio Benjamin proposed the adoption of the agenda, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Benji.
I wish to support. Seconded by Luana, Chair.
Honorable Luana is seconding. Thank you. Now we get to item number 4, honorable members. Let me look for my item number 4. That is the purpose of us gathering here. Thank you, honorable members. We are gathered here in a virtual public hearing on the Draft Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Bill 2020. It is marked EC B4 2020. The Executive Committee of the Legislature resolved on the 26th May 2016 that draft legislation to amend money bills must be initiated to ensure enhanced oversight in the consideration of the provincial budget. This decision was endorsed by the Rules Committee at its meeting held on 29 March 2017. The ad hoc committee was subsequently established in terms of the standing rules of the provincial legislature. Then the committee was revived in the 6th term of the legislature in order to finish its work. The terms of reference for the committee were given and adopted by the House to oversee the drafting of a white paper on the policy behind the proposed legislation and facilitate consultation on the white paper, table the white paper for consideration by the House, oversee the development of a draft money bills amendment bill to give effect to Section 120, subsection 3 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa of 1996, and facilitate publication of the draft bill in accordance with the standing rules of the legislature. To introduce the bill to the House for consideration, to conduct legislative processes aimed at finalizing the bill, including public consultations with the relevant stakeholders in accordance with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 1996, and the standing rules of the legislature on the bill, and present its reports to the House. The legislative mandate that we're having, as I have mentioned earlier on, the mandate for the ad hoc committee is derived from Section 120, subsection 3 of the Constitution, which provides that, I quote, a provincial act must provide for a procedure by which the province's legislature may amend a money bill, close quote. It is also derived from standing rules, rule number 154, sub rule 3, which states that, I quote, a money bill may only be amended by the legislature in terms of the procedure provided for in an act of the legislature, close quote. Then the process thus far, the committee has since its establishment met and produced a draft white paper and a draft bill, which are utilized to solicit comments from various relevant stakeholders. The committee also had a first of its kind benchmarking with the Finance and Fiscal Commission, that is FFC, of South Africa, and with the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, which passed a similar bill towards the end of the 5th term. The committee has also attended and participated in the 3rd African Network of Parliamentary Budget Officers conference hosted by the National Parliament in Cape Town in 2018, as well as the 4th African Network of Parliamentary Budget Officers conference hosted by the Parliament of Ghana in Accra, Ghana in 2019. The draft bill was published in the Provincial Gazette number 4389 for comments on the 4th of February 2020. Engagement with Provincial Treasury, Office of the Premier, members of the legislature, and the Auditor General also took place in the legislature. The bill was subsequently introduced to the legislature on the 3rd July 2020. That was a House sitting. It was adopted by the House and further referred back to the committee, the subcommittee on money bills, to initiate now the processes of the public hearings, the consultations, up until the draft is ready for the final adoption. Further comments were invited on the bill through email, media, that is print media, radio adverts, social media platforms, and even our interactions with our counterparts. Now, the purpose of this meeting, honorable members and our guests, Section 118 of the Constitution enjoins the legislature to facilitate public involvement in its legislative processes. The ad hoc committee has therefore, despite the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, deemed it prudent to convene this meeting with all stakeholders in order to seek oral and further written inputs on the bill as introduced. So that is the main purpose of this meeting, is to have the public hearing on the bill, on the draft bill. Thank you very much, honorable members. Before we proceed to the other items on the agenda, let us remind ourselves of the housekeeping, the rules for the meetings that we hold in the legislature, and also for this ad hoc committee meeting that we are holding today. Honorable members, before we commence, may I take this opportunity to lay down some ground rules that will assist in facilitating our virtual meeting. All participants are reminded that this is a meeting of an ad hoc committee of the legislature, and therefore all standing rules of the legislature apply. The legislature has adopted interim rules for the virtual sittings and committee meetings, but those must be regarded as supplementary to the existing standing rules. You are all requested to always keep your microphones on mute when not speaking, as this helps to prevent noise, echo, and disruptions from background noise around you. Please keep cell phones and other devices on silent. Kindly indicate to the chairperson via a message in the chat box or raise your hand option when you want to be recognized. Participants are requested to, where possible, keep their videos on when speaking so that we can be able to identify the person who is in the meeting. Except those that are facing connection challenges, network and all that, when a video would affect negatively your coverage. We also request presenters to keep the video on when presenting or responding to a question. As a word of advice, you are all requested to always check the appropriateness of the background of your videos, and also to dress decently in compliance with the standing rules and the adopted policy on dress code of the legislature. I thank you. Now let us look at our agenda. Honorable members, technical team, let's slide the agenda again. Thank you very much. So we've dealt with the purpose of the meeting and the ground rules. Now we get to item number 5, submission on the bill. The first one will be from Sam, 20 minutes. Ms. Mutudi or Ms. Msindo. Over to you, our guest.
Chair, may I just make a slight amendment that they will both be presenting, Ms. Mutudi and Ms. Msindo.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Over to you, ladies. So you will have your 10 minutes to make a total of 20.
Good morning, all. Please bear with me while I attempt to switch on my video as instructed. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity for the PSAM to come and present on the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Bill. The Public Service Accountability Monitor, also known as PSAM, forms part of the School of Journalism and Media Studies, which is found at Rose University, Makanda. The PSAM activities include research, monitoring, advocacy, and capacity building. While PSAM values the opportunity afforded to us by the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature to submit written comment and proposals on the Draft Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Bill, public participation in processes relating to money bills at the provincial level has the potential to strengthen overall oversight and people-centered policymaking. On the 3rd of April 2020, the International Budget Partnership, also known as the IBP, released the outcomes of the 2019 Open Budget Survey. The Open Budget Survey is a biennial survey and is the world's only independent measure of fiscal openness. The South Africa's transparency scores in the Open Budget Survey of 2019 were the highest of all countries, 87 out of 100. However, the public participation in budget processes received a dismal score of 24 out of 100. Our submission today relates to the need for mechanisms to be introduced into the bill to support improved budget oversight and public participation in the budget process. We have been informed that we have 10 minutes allocated per speaker and therefore ask that all questions be asked at the end. The PSAM acknowledges the inclusion of public participation in the draft bill. To allow for effective public participation, it is important that relevant materials or deliberations are promoted in at least 2 of the province's dominant languages. To begin, I would like to turn the participants' attention to page 7 and 10 of the PSAM submission. I will be dealing with clauses 7 and 12, and my colleague Esteri Msindo will be dealing with clauses 5, 6, and 15. Clause 7. Clause 7 relates to the procedure prior to the introduction of the provincial budget. 7.1, and members, or the assumption is that all the members have been given the PSAM submission, and that all the members are aware of what each clause, the provisions rather of each clause. So I will just be proceeding with our recommendations for what should be included or excluded within the clauses. The PSAM proposes that clause 7.1 be amended to include an additional criteria H for the assessing of the performance of each provincial department. This would in turn read that the legislature, through its committees, must annually assess the performance of each provincial department with reference to H, the quarterly statements of receipts and payments and quarterly provincial budget and expenditure reports. Moving on to 7.3. The PSAM proposes that clause 7.3 be amended to include an additional criteria D to the requirements of the budget review and recommendation report. The budget review and recommendation report must be publicized on the legislature's website within 7 days of it being tabled. I now move on to clause 12, which addresses and deals with public participation. As it stands, the current clause on public participation does not provide the ways in which the Budget Committee will seek representation from the public. The Portfolio Committee plays a vital role in facilitating public participation by providing forums such as public hearings for the public to air their views. The PSAM proposes that clause 12.1 be amended to include an additional criteria 12.1 to 12.4, and 12.2, outlining the methods that the Budget Committee should use in seeking representation from the public when considering economic and budget policies and provincial appropriation bills. The Budget Committee, when considering the economic and budget policies, provincial appropriation bills, and other money bills, should seek representation from the public by 12.1.1, conducting public hearings on the budget and revenue proposals and availing policy materials in accessible languages and formats. 12.1.2, holding public hearings to engage the public on economic and budgetary policies. 12.1.3, collaborating with the media and community radio stations to inform the public about opportunities to contribute to money bills considerations within the legislature. Lastly, 12.1.4, allowing the public sufficient time to submit written and oral presentation. For instance, at least 30 days from the date of call for comment for the submission of written and oral presentation on the provincial's appropriation bill. Just a reiteration at this point that the PSAM strongly believes that in order for the public to be able to engage with requests to participate in submissions around things like the provincial appropriations bills or the money bills for that matter, the public needs to be, or rather the call to the public needs to be put out or facilitated in a language that allows the public to engage with the content and to engage with the relevant bill in order to get a better understanding of the bill in a language that they are able to engage more sufficiently with. And we feel that that is what is currently missing with regards to the call for comment from the public. With regards to section, or rather clause 12.2, the PSAM proposes that clause 12.2 confirm that such recommendations received shall be taken into account when the Budget Committee makes recommendations to the House. Considering money bills during national and provincial state of disaster. Clauses within the PFMA provide guidance on financial management in emergency situations. In particular, Clause 16.4 obliges the Minister to account for decisions taken in this regard to Parliament and the Auditor General within 14 days. Section 25 of the PFMA makes similar provisions for the allocation and expenditure of emergency funds at the provincial level from the Provincial Revenue Fund. In this instance, the relevant MEC for Finance is required to report to the Legislature and Auditor General, and this is outlined under sections 25.4. In both instances, the Minister or MEC must table this expenditure either in the next adjustment budget or in another appropriation within 120 days, whichever is sooner. Given the complexity of this arrangement, the above-mentioned arrangement, the PFM urges the Legislature to incorporate clear provisions within the bill for consideration of money bills during emergency contexts. In particular, it is suggested that the Legislature specify within the bill exactly what levels of reporting and accountability is required by the Finance MEC and relevant departments, including the regularity of such reporting, what specific reporting details relating to the allocation and expenditure of emergency funds by the MEC and relevant departments, and what mechanisms for receiving and considering public inputs on such emergency funds have been made available, and how have these informed the allocation and expenditure of such funds. I would like to draw the attention of the members to the recent PowerPoint presentation, or rather MPL briefing on the Ad Hoc Committee of Promulgation of the Money Bills Act. And in particular, I would like to draw the attention of members, if the members have it readily available and open before them. If not, my apologies for the assumption. But I'd like to draw their attention specifically to a point that was made in page 4, that the bill intends to empower the legislature to be an active and efficient, the bill intends to empower the legislature to be an active and effective participant in the budget process. Legislature oversight is more important, is nowhere more important than over the budget. I would also like to bring the participants' attention to page 6 of the same presentation, which respectively dealt with the importance of oversight. And a reiteration then, it becomes apparent that the money bill amendment will be done from an oversight perspective. And in terms of the Constitution, the oversight role is located within Parliament and the provincial legislatures to provide for mechanisms to ensure that all executive organs of state in the national provincial spheres of government are accountable. And this is intended at advancing the ideals of good government and cooperative governance. I thank everybody for the opportunity to give my oral presentation on the PSAM submission. And I now hand over to my colleague Asteri Msindo, who will be addressing additional clauses that the PSAM has made submissions on. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ms. Motudi. Over to you, Ms. Msindo. Ms. Msindo. Mme Motudi, a ko mo jwetse hore a mute.
Mme ke tla mmolella. I see Ms. Msindo doesn't have the option to mute and unmute herself. I think she may be having technical difficulties on her side. And I'm wondering if for that reason I shouldn't, and in order for us to continue with the processes, I shouldn't perhaps address her sections.
Yes, please.
Or in the alternative, I can ask for Mr. Miller to continue or to present in the meantime while I'll try and assist Ms. Msindo with her presentation, just in case there are questions asked of her that I may not be privy to answering, if that's fine.
I could hear there was a voice in the background. Is it not Ms. Msindo?
No, ma'am, I don't think
Not
so.
yet. Okay.
I think she's currently still battling to log on. So if
noting that during this time of the lockdowns and ESCOM things, we usually have network challenges during the day. Then in the afternoons, then it becomes a better time for our virtual meetings. So I would request that you carry on, also present her part.
Okay, no problem. If you just allow me a few minutes just to get her part open in front of me so that I can properly represent her.
Okay. In the meantime, honorable members, whilst they are preparing for their presentation to be flighted, let us note all our questions for clarity, but we shall allow also the next presenter to present. Then we'll ask those questions at the end as per the agenda adopted. Thank you, honorable members. Advocate Beja, are you able, Dr. Miataza, Nechi, are you able to have this presentation and flight it?
I'm flying it, Chair. Is it not appearing on your side?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
My apologies, it is appearing. It's just difficult to read it off my it's easier to read it off my screen than off yours. So I've just tried to open it on my screen. Okay.
All right.
Thank you to everybody for your patience. If I can just put my camera back on again, and I will then address clauses 5, clauses 6, and clauses 15, which my colleague Asteria Msindo was going to be addressing.
Excuse me, Ms. Mutudi, because now you are presenting and we have this flighted on our screens and on your screen, you can put off your video.
Great, thank you.
Please, but towards the end of the meetings, we'd like to see you when you respond to questions.
No problem, Chair, thank you.
Okay.
With regards to Clause 5, Clause 5.1, the PSAM proposes that Clause 5.1 should be amended to read as follows. The Budget Committee must consider the draft budget policy statement presented to the House, evaluate budget estimates, economic and budgetary policies and programs with direct outlays. The PSAM also proposes that 5.3 be amended to read as follows. The Budget Committee must receive reports on budgets from portfolio committees and must publish these reports on the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature website within 5 days of the House sitting. Moving on to Clause 6. The PSAM proposes that Clause 6 be reworded and provided clarity on how often the public hearings will be held. These could be scheduled in March before the tabling of the provincial budget, in July and in October, aligning with the tabling of the provincial MTP BS. Clause 15, which deals with the provincial legislature budget unit. The PSAM acknowledges that while it's an important principle, it is not easily measurable or enforceable. In order to increase the strength of these relationships as a means of deepening the rigor with which committees provide budget oversight, there is a need for a clearer link between accountability and performance, or accountability/performance link. The PSAM thus proposes an addition of the following. We propose that a clause be added on the appointment of staff working in the budget unit with emphasis on the requisite financial and research skills. This must include an explicit clause pertaining to the competencies of research content advisory staff. In addition, there must be a clause added outlining how reporting is done by the budget unit and to whom. There must be another addition of explicit mandate role of the unit to provide content to committees. Lastly, there must be an addition of a clause requiring the budget unit to publish its research reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mutudi. You have assisted the meeting. Let's now get to the next presenter. That will be Dr. Muller from UJ. Over to you, Dr. Muller. You have your 20 minutes. Dr. Muller. Mm. Is Dr. Muller in the house?
I see him, Chair, but I'm not sure if he can speak.
Please unmute Dr. Muller.
Chair, I will just contact Dr. Muller and see if he's having any technical difficulties as well. I'll revert in a few minutes.
Please.
Chair, I managed to get hold of him. He's trying to get back in.
Okay, okay.
Right.
Yeah, in the mornings we usually have these problems. The network challenges. The load shedding is locking down. I can feel the footsteps. There's someone coming.
Good morning, honourable members. Apologies for that.
Yes, Dr. Muller, you are welcome.
Thank you.
We're just awaiting you with your presentation. Thank you
Right.
very much. Over to you. You have your 20 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairperson. I'm assuming that Advocate Beja will be paging through the presentation. Let me just do an introduction. So I'm from the Public and Environmental Economics Research Centre at the University of Johannesburg. And we do work on public finance oversight, public economics, and other matters. In this particular case, I've been doing some work on provincial oversight of public finances for a project called Putting People in the People's Parliament, which is co-funded by the European Union and the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And that's along with colleagues at the Public Service Accountability Monitor who just presented. So I would say that the matters I'm going to present on are compatible with what colleagues at PSAM have already said. But I will focus on a couple of different, or at least somewhat different issues. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so I just to kind of provide some background. Obviously, as the Honourable Chairperson already pointed out, the committee has been, the ad hoc committee and the legislature have been engaging with this for some time. I think the first thing to say is that it's great that the provincial legislature is doing this. Only one legislature has actually passed the legislation required by S120 of the Constitution, and so in that sense, it's long overdue and a welcome development. On the one hand, it presents an opportunity to reflect, I think, on the experience of public finance oversight over the last 23 years, the limitations and the challenges of that, and the opportunities to have, as my colleagues at PSAM already said, greater involvement from civil society and the public at large. On the other hand, there's also the risk that it could be treated as a compliance exercise, and that in fact it might embed limitations of the practices of the last 23 years. So for myself, I prefer to see it as an opportunity, but I think it's important to bear in mind that it could also be a risk and this is not just relevant, of course, to the Eastern Cape legislature, but all the other legislatures like Western Cape and KZN that have started to look at this issue. We can move to the next slide. So in that regard, I think on the one hand, this kind of legislation had not been passed before until last year. But on the other hand, we do have the National Money Bills Act, and we also have, and the GPL did pass the Money Bills Act last year, or at least, yes, it was at the beginning of last year. And I think there are some errors that the GPL made that other provincial legislatures can learn from. At a high level, there was a failure really to think through the nature of the provincial oversight process. So I think the GPL relied a little bit too much on the national legislation, and of course the national oversight process is linked to the provincial one, but it's not quite the same thing. And in fact, nobody really seems to have thought through the best way in which provinces should approach their oversight of money bills when thinking about an amendment, and I'll get to the logic of that in the next slide. And also the GPL rushed the process, so there were errors and ambiguities in the legislation. If we could just stay on that slide briefly, Advocate. Thank you. So just two specific problems, because these actually relate to the issues I'll also be focusing on in relation to the ECPL bill. So there were two specific problems with the GPL's Act. The first one was that it doesn't really incorporate the division of revenue mandating process. So I think all or most members will know that the provincial legislatures have to give a mandate to the NCOP in order to process the National Division of Revenue bill. Now that mandating process is not incorporated into the GPL's legislation, and it's a problem because the expectations that the province or the requests that the province has of the Division of Revenue bill should be linked to any possible amendments it makes within the provincial legislature itself, relating, for example, to appropriations. So it's very important to integrate that, and that hasn't been done in the GPL Act. And then the second specific problem that's concerned me is that the GPL seeks to establish a provincial legislature budget office following the national legislature. For myself, I don't have a strong position either way as to whether this is a good idea or not. But what is clear is that the academic literature and the policy literature suggests certain key principles that these budget offices should comply with in order to be effective. And the Gauteng Act doesn't really implement those principles, and it doesn't learn from the national legislation, so the national legislation in 2009 was arguably better than what the GPL has now published itself in relation to the budget office. And at the national level, its provisions in relation to the budget office were improved even further by amendments in 2018. So really, I'm just saying this because I think that's an opportunity. You know, when we have another related institution in the country that has learned certain lessons and implemented good international principles, I think that's an opportunity to learn from and to incorporate in some way into the provincial process. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So just to get back to the point about the logic, for myself, I find it's very important not to lose sight of the fundamental purpose of the legislation as per S120 of the Constitution, which is to facilitate legislature amendment of money bills. So on the one hand, yes, it's important to lay out the process, but it's also important not to lose sight of the logic of it. And what I mean by that is, it's helpful to imagine a practical situation. Imagine that the Eastern Cape legislature decides to amend the provincial appropriation bill to allocate, say, 5 billion rand from education to health. How would the legislature go about reaching that conclusion in a structured way? Where would public input happen in that process? Very importantly, how much time would be needed to satisfy any of the requirements for the amendment that have been included in the Money Bills Act? And where would the institutional capacity exist to advise on and substantiate such an amendment? So when I say substantiate, of course, the legislature has the power to make these decisions, but by virtue, one can see this in the current bill, for example, the legislature and in the Gauteng bill and also in the National Money Bill, National Money Bills Act, there are requirements there that the legislature expects itself to satisfy. So those have been put in the legislation. And the question is, how would the legislature satisfy its own requirements that it's put into the Act? And so when one thinks about this, certainly in my experience at the national level, and then one looks at the legislation, one realizes that actually the legislation is very demanding in terms of what it expects of the legislature, and the timelines are very demanding. And so I think this is something that needs to be kept, in one's mind when looking at the legislation, to think, would this actually be practical? Could the legislature actually pull this off? And if not, then maybe additional capacity needs to be facilitated, or additional time needs to be made available within the legislation itself. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Right, so I mean, I've touched on these already in what I was saying about the logic. So some of the key considerations are what are the core areas of oversight and the practicalities of amendment? Is the timing appropriate for each component of the process? When will public participation be facilitated? And my colleagues at PSAM are experts on this, and they've made detailed recommendations on how best to facilitate public participation and make it more substantive. So I support all of those. And then the final one is capacity. And there's two sides to the capacity, as honourable members will know. The one side is for the members themselves, but the other side is staff. And I think the staffing side is very important, because members are not necessarily expected to be experts in public finance, and even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily have all the time required to investigate the relevant issues and put together the documents substantiating particular positions and so forth. So it's important to have some kind of institutional support, and that links to the issue of a parliamentary or provincial legislature budget office. So as I say, I don't really have a strong view on this. I think it's hard to make a case for a PLBO in a small province because of the resources that would be required for the office relative to the actual resources that the legislature is considering. But I think in the larger provinces like Gauteng, Western Cape, KZN and Eastern Cape, there might well be a case to be made. So for me, it's really a practical question as to what kind of institution will best support members and the intention of the legislation. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on that just now. So we can move to the next section of the presentation. Okay, so I'm just going to get to specific comments. My colleagues at PSAM did an admirable job in working through their specific recommendations. I decided that given the limited time available, I would rather talk to three broad areas of concern. The written submission has clause-by-clause comments. The written submission that I've submitted to Advocate Beja has clause-by-clause comments, and so members can refer to that. But given the time available, I just wanted to talk about these three areas. So the first one is the one that I touched on in relation to the limitations of the GPL Act. And that pertains to sequencing of amendment processes with the Division of Revenue. So to give an example, it wouldn't make sense for a provincial legislature to accept the provincial fiscal framework while its position on the Division of Revenue bill was that the province should be allocated more funds. One could then end up in a bizarre situation, hypothetically, where the province has approved its fiscal framework, but then the NCOP manages to facilitate a change on behalf of the province that allocates it a greater share of the Division of Revenue. For myself, I'm not a lawyer, and perhaps it's the kind of thing that Advocate Beja could advise the committee on at some point, but it's not clear to me what the legal implications of that would be, because the National Parliament has taken a decision that's binding upon it to provide more revenue to the province, but the province has already tied its own hands by accepting by approving a fiscal framework that doesn't include that revenue. So in order to avoid that kind of incoherence, my suggestion is that the Division of Revenue mandating process be integrated with the provisions for the fiscal oversight by the legislature in relation, for example, to its fiscal framework and also its appropriation bill. So that's the first thing, and I haven't made specific recommendations in that regard because it actually requires some substantive thought about how best to sequence those things, and also within the context of how the provincial legislature has been operating to date in relation to the mandating process. I should say again that this is not something that's a unique challenge, of course, to the Eastern Cape legislature. It comes up in relation to all the other ones. In the research we did, which looked at the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and Gauteng, we found a number of cases where the mandating, prior to the introduction of any money bills legislation, where the mandating process was not sequenced with the oversight process within the legislature. So this is something that's been happening in the past, and that comes back to my point about this legislation, which is to avoid embedding limitations or problems from previous periods into the legislation, rather see the legislation as an opportunity to unearth these challenges and address them. So that's the first one, which is the incorporation of the division of revenue process. The second part relates to the provincial legislature budget unit, or more commonly referred to as a budget office. Now, the original submission I made, which is the one that members will still have, that was on the draft bill. Raised concerns with the vagueness and lack of detail in the draft bill, and that was in the context of the draft bill conceiving of, or apparently conceiving of, an independent unit of some kind. In the bill that's now been tabled, the document appears to conceive of an internal unit, and I say internal in the sense that the secretary is assigned the responsibility of appointing staff. Now, as I said, I don't have a strong position either way on which is the appropriate approach. I think that there are arguments for and against either. So either having a properly independent office. And when I say independent, I mean institutionally independent. So that means it has its own funds. It has a director who is appointed directly by the legislature itself for a fixed and renewable period of time. The kinds of provisions one has, for example, for a post like the public protector. Okay, so the public protector is nominated by Parliament and approved by the President, but ultimately operates in a relatively independent fashion, and that's important for the kinds of work that they do. And when one looks at the experiences with parliamentary budget officers and the relevant literature, that's the kind of structure that's recommended. Essentially, not because it's likely to be as controversial or need as much protection as a public protector office, but because it needs to be politically neutral, and because it needs to really be able to attract the best expertise and operate in a manner that is credibly independent, not just for the benefit of members, but also for the benefit of the public. So a lot of work that these kinds of offices do internationally is actually beneficial to the broader public and civil society because it's independent work, even if it's commissioned by members who ask the office to look at particular issues. So if the option is to go with something that's an independent office, then it needs to fulfill the criteria that are generally recommended for that independence. On the other hand, if it's going to be an internal unit, then there's a question as to whether it should really be placed in the legislation at all. So as things stand, it seems like there are provisions in the legislation, but they're not entirely clear on how this would operate. So it seems to be now for an internal unit, but there isn't clarity on, well, why, if it's an internal unit, then why does it need to be placed in legislation? Because there is significance to creating an institution within legislation. Now, if we're creating an internal institution within legislation, I'm not really sure what the rationale is for that, but it would also require greater clarity on how that institution is going to work, why it's actually being legislated, and so forth. So I think the point there is the committee needs to make a decision, a sharp decision on which kind of institution it wants. If it wants an independent, a more independent provincial legislature budget office, then it needs to make sure that the relevant clauses are there to protect its independence, to ensure it's adequately resourced, as my colleagues from PSAM said, to make sure that there are specific provisions for the qualifications and integrity of any director and the staff, and so forth. And the appointment process for the director is very important in order for such an office to fulfill its role. On the other hand, if it's an internal unit, then I think there needs to be some reflection on whether that's appropriate to put in legislation and what kind of detail is required there. To my knowledge, it's unconventional to legislate for an internal unit that would operate in the same way as any other division within the provincial legislature. And then finally, to think a little bit more about the demands placed on the legislature. So, for example, what I was referring to earlier is the legislation, partly following the National Money Bills Act, lists requirements for an amendment. So these are requirements that, for example, were the legislature to make a decision and be challenged in court, it would have to prove that it's met. And if one looks at, so these are in Section 10, Clause 9. And it's interesting for me to contrast those requirements with the requirements for the Treasury, whether provincial Treasury or national Treasury. If one looks at legislation, the requirements that legislatures are placing on their own amendments are often more demanding than the requirements that are placed on the actual national and provincial budgets. And I'm not saying that that's an undesirable thing per se, but when one reflects on the capacity constraints of legislatures relative to the treasuries, which have hundreds, or in the case of the National Treasury, almost 1,000 staff, one has to wonder whether those requirements are practical. And if they're not practical, then potentially it undermines the purpose of the legislation. If requirements are included for an amendment that the legislature can't plausibly meet were it to be challenged. And a related but different point is the role of budgetary review and recommendation reports. And in that regard, while again, the intentions of the legislation are good, the experience at the national level, when I worked at the National Parliament and also from engaging with others on this, is that these BRRRs are very demanding, and in terms of the time and effort required, and they can sometimes distract committees from specific important issues that should be being considered prior to the introduction of the budget in order to focus on complying with legislation. So again, I don't have a strong view on that, but I think someone, whether the honourable members or the officials assisting the ad hoc committee, should pay some attention to the question of the demands that are being placed on the legislature that are implicit in this legislation, and whether the legislature will be able to meet those demands in a substantive way with the capacity it's likely to have. So those are the three main areas I wanted to talk to honourable members. As I say, there's more detail in the written submission, and at the end of this presentation, I've just included some slides with more detail on parliamentary budget officers, but I'm not going to go into those now because we don't have time, but I've just, those are the ones. I'm not going to go into them now, but they're just there for the benefit of honourable members if they want to take a look afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muller. Thank you for your presentation. Now let's take hands from the honourable members. Any questions for clarity? And be ready, Advocate Beja. Immediately after the questions, you will. I'll give you some 3 minutes or so. I'm now checking on the chat box. Also coming back to the main screen. Honourable members, are there any that would like to ask questions for clarity?
Yes, Chairperson.
Let
I'm
me
not
note
able
the
to write in
hands.
the chat box, Chair.
Let me note the hands. You just name your surname.
Camilio Benjamin, Chair.
Honourable Benji. Honourable Luana. Who else? Who else? Honorable Odendal, where are you? So I have those two hands. Okay. Thank you. In that order, honorable members. Honorable Camilio Benjamin, followed by Honorable Luana.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson, and greetings to everybody in the meeting. And thank you for the two presentations, Chair, as well as your explanation on the purpose and how far we are. Chair, to the first presentation, I just wanted to understand, Chair, the understanding of the missing issue with language. Is it that the whole bill and the communication of it should be in different languages? And then the proposal of the clauses that was submitted about the accountability and versus the performance. Just a little bit more clarity on that one, Chair. That is from PSAM. And then from the second presentation of peers, Chair, the presenter is saying that the division of revenue bill should be integrated versus the NCOP. So we need to tread carefully, Chair, as to that we don't constrict ourselves, as the presenter was saying, in one or two things. So I think we will have to have a little bit more in-depth explanation on that one. And then the other one that also needs a bit clarity, you were saying, although he's saying he's not an expert, if it's an internal unit versus legislation, so that we don't create legislation, or it's not a necessity for us to have legislation if it's just going to be an internal unit. Because both were saying that, both presentations were saying, if you really look at it, Chair, that it should be an independent unit. Although I know in ours it says they will report to the secretary. So we just need to have a clarity more on that, Chair. I think those are my two clarities that I would want to ask. Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to ask clarity questions.
Thank you, Honorable Camilio Benjamin. Honorable Luana.
Yes, Chair. And, morning to our guests, presenters. Chair, I don't really have much other than just to appreciate the submissions, which I found them opening much more in terms of areas that maybe ambiguous, you know. There's on the PSAM presentation, Chair, I think I must have missed this, but I was excited when I had something on the incorporation. I think there was a mention on the incorporation of the emergency situation. I don't know whether that's my interpretation, but there was, of course, a mention of an emergency situation in terms of these transparent processes in the line of whether it's appropriation or the spend itself. But yes, thanks for flagging it. But again, I would my eyesight is a bit awkward as well. But I hope I will be helped in terms of understanding that. Because I would want the comment just to be, or just some, or that area be restated. I may have missed it, Chair. On the presentation by Dr. Muller, of course, Honorable Benjamin has already touched on the DORA matter. especially in relation to the mandate, the provincial mandate to the NCOP, because often the Finance Committee or the legislature would, through the Finance Committee and its delegation, would make that presentation to the NCOP sitting on appropriations, But what then becomes an issue is the attention of the national, in particular National Treasury, or incorporating of those submissions, in the future budgetary processes. That is an issue, because some would have been submitted over a period of time. Say, we've been making a submission on the what to call on the provincial allocations for the past 3 years, but again, you see no changes, especially in relation to some of the aspects within DORA, say your transport fund, those kinds of things. I'm trying to find out how best can the budget office interface with that, and where can we learn a good example, say currently, whether Gauteng has not been able to get through that process via its budget office, since he's working close with the Gauteng budget office, so to speak. I just want, if there is any of the example that you would, but I know it's too early for Gauteng because they were just established a year ago. The other part, Chair, overall, which I would want to get a comment from both presenters, is the issue of the move towards zero-based budgeting. How much of all this would impact into the zero-based budgeting, if they can comment on that. And lastly, Chair, from both presentation, I know that there are specific submissions that are made in terms of sharpening some of the clauses and subsections, as proposed. But whether we like it or not, there is that which thinly suggests that there may be, at a particular point, some tension between the executive and the budget office. I hope you get me on that. And in this instance, the ministry, if I were to use that, or shall I say, no, let me be specific. There may be some tensions between the Treasury and the budget office in certain aspects of work. Have they not found anything in that area, Chair? Or if they can comment on that, if there are any of those things, so that we also seek to get to those details. Chair, those are the areas on my part. I'm sorry if I have not come up very sharply in terms of being specific per se.
Thank you, Honorable Luana and Honorable Benji. I'll give now over to Advocate Beja or Dr. Miataza to give us that 3 minutes presentation, because some of the questions may have been captured in our process going forward, or the concerns that have been raised in the submissions. So let us now give over to Advocate Beja or Dr. Miataza to give us that 3 minutes presentation. After the three presenters, hoping that ubuyile Miss Msindo, after the three presenters responding to our questions for clarity, I'll give Dr. Jantjies 3 minutes to say something, to us. That would be very much appreciated, as well as Honorable Nkondlo. Yeah, I'll give you just 2 minutes to talk to us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Advocate Beja.
Thank you, Chair. We were hoping that we would come in after the presenters so that we also tie in with the process going forward. With your permission, Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's take the presenters then to respond to the questions. I'll start with, in that order, it will be Ms. Mutudi, followed by her colleague, Ms. Msindo, if she has managed to come back. Then if she's not in, Ms. Mutudi will take them all, the questions. Then it will be Dr. Muller.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, honourable members. I will be addressing the first question that was asked with regards to the languages. The recommendation from the PSAM was that indeed the call for members of the public to submit their submissions for money bills and any other related bill that comes from the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature, along with the bill in itself. Both of them should be in, I would go so far as to say, 2 of the dominant languages that are currently being spoken within the Eastern Cape context. And this should be the case for anything that comes out of the legislative space, whereas, the public are asked to engage and to give submissions on that particular thing. With regards to the second question that was posed by the honourable member, I would like to kindly ask that she either repeats the question, or if my colleague can address it, because I didn't quite hear it well. My apologies for that. I will then be addressing the third question that was asked by the honourable member, and specifically pertaining to consideration of money bills during national and provincial states of disaster. Our presentation itself can be seen on page 5, or the section which deals with considerations of money bill under states of disasters can be seen on page 5 for your convenience, honourable member. But in particular, what the PSAM was recommending was that the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature incorporates clear provisions within the bill for consideration of money bills during emergency contexts. In particular, we suggested that the legislature specify in the bill what level of reporting and accountability will be required by the Finance MNC and relevant departments with regards to the regularity of reporting, what specific reporting details relating to the allocation and expenditure of emergency funds by the MEC and relevant departments, along with the mechanisms for receiving and considering public inputs on such emergency funds when they've been made available, and how these were informed, and how the allocation of the allocation and the expenditure of the funds took place. If the honourable member has any additional questions, because he had asked for clarity and had asked for me to reiterate that particular section, so that's what I've done. With regards to the last question on zero-based budgeting, and pardon me if I have misinterpreted your question, honourable member, but I considered your question to mean, or to ask rather, whether with zero-based budgeting, all of our recommendations is something that, you know, the legislature can, you know, afford to implement. And, you know, considering that the legislature has a public participation budget, I think the question will then need to be to what extent what our requests or recommendation fall outside of what the public participation budget, or our understanding of what the public participation budget currently covers. We are also aware that there is a program within the Eastern Cape legislature which deals specifically with public participation and education around public participation. And, you know, again, the question will then be to what extent, our recommendations fall outside of what is currently being budgeted for. And, you know, personally, we don't see it. So it would be, I would then ask the honourable member to indicate to what extent, you know, our recommendations might necessarily fall outside of the public participation budget of the legislature. I hope I've answered all questions, and thank you, honourable members. I now pass the baton over to my colleague Asteri Msindo to address any questions that might have come up pertaining to her section. And I think the second question asked by the honourable member, the first honourable member that asked the questions, I think that may have been the question covering my colleague's section, but I'm not too sure. Thank you, honourable members.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mutudi. Ms. Msindo, are you back? Not yet. Okay. Over to you, Dr. Muller. Dr. Muller. Dr. Muller. KV, can you check on Dr. Muller?
I will do so, okay, thanks.
Or is it a network problem or?
Maybe, Chair, myself and Dr. Minters may then come in so long.
No. Let's get Dr. Janjis, then Honorable Nkondlo. You will follow those two honorable members.
Noted.
Dr. Jantjies,
Dr. Mueller.
is he in? Dr. Mueller? Not yet, eh? Okay. Let's get Dr. Jantjies, our Parliamentary Budget Office. Dr. Jantjies? Dr. Jantjies, are you in?
Good morning, Chair. I'm struggling a bit, but I just got connected. I think I got lost somehow. I don't know if you can hear me, Chair.
Yes, we do hear you.
Yes, thank you so much. I did mention to colleagues, Dr. Myatas, that I'm unable to get my video in. So please I do apologize to the chairperson and other members in this regard, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity for, being part of the discussions. And we think it's a very important process that the provincial legislature is going through. From our perspective, as well as the National Budget Office, we are here to support the colleagues in this regard in the legislature, and also to give inputs where necessary. I think just a quick comment. I was not really prepared for giving input, but hey, I'm in the meeting, so I might as well give input. Thank you so much for that. Just want to greet the honor members, colleagues as well, and you, the chairperson. Thank you so much. I think I appreciate my colleagues' inputs as well on the presentations. Thank you so much. I'm also learning something as well over the time. But I think obviously my comment will be largely based on the research and also on the experiences we have here in National. And I think firstly, we one of the points that we always emphasize is the importance of the money bills as an act. Very important as it's enshrined in legislation, it's long overdue. And I think our experience for the past 6 years has seen a lot of very value-added engagements with the government, as a result of the role of the Act, which prescribes specific rules, specific processes, but also having the Budget Office, which provides, quite an effective inputs, technical inputs, which is largely independent, meaning that it's our own inputs based on the research and literature, in that regard. And I think for myself, we have seen a lot of members appreciating, the inputs and also engagement that we make. And information also, what's important, we've seen is the role of government. I think over the years, we have seen government appreciating having the money bills and implementing it, but also appreciating Budget Office as support structure for the legislature in processing money bills. And we've seen quite a lot of engagements which really are more value add for the public finance in general, But I think I was quite stricken by the report, on the international budget organizations there. And I think it's a point I want to raise as well with regards to public participation in the process, Chair. Because I think the biggest challenge, in my view, with my experience here, which has been raised by the committees here in National, has always been how do you ensure a very inclusive and very comprehensive public participation in the budget process. And I think from my perspective, there certainly need to be a lot of creative in terms of how you get that, in particular in our country now. How do you ensure there's a lot of inclusive participations in the process? I mean, some of the suggestion has always been that how do you make sure there's enough time? I know there's a court cases, related to public participation. So I think it's a important aspect to pay attention to it in the legislation. How to ensure a broader, inclusive public participation, but also the point I want to emphasize, Chair, it's a need to strike a very good balance between over prescription of the legislation and what matters should be dealt with the rules. I think that also needs to be a good balance there. You know, I heard the colleagues raise a lot of points in terms of what process is in place, but I think there need to be a good balance in terms of what matters you want to wire up in the legislature and what matters should be in the rules of the legislature in terms of considering the mechanisms. Last point on the independence or the non-independence of the budget office. I think the view, you know, I always take, Chair and honourable members, has always been, it boils back to what we want out of this whole thing, you know, as a legislature, as public, as society, what we want out of the budget office, you know, and then I think that should drive what kind of animal you want to have in the legislature. I mean, as Dr. Miller has mentioned in the literature, there's different kinds of animals you get out there, but I think context does matter a lot in a sense of, if you have this kind of budget office, what is the context that you want to have it in South Africa, in Gauteng, in Eastern Cape? The context really does differ in that regard. And of course, talks to issue of the capacity, which capacity you able to get and what capacity you want, you know, and what areas you want to focus on. Because I mean, my sense always been that at a provincial level, it's largely expenditure analysis that would be probably more easy value add, you know, and so on. And yes, many of the budget offices globally are more independent from the institutions, but working within the institutions, of course. Independent in terms of providing its analysis, independence in terms of mandate, in terms of getting their finances, getting their appointing the staffs and so on. But I think what's always important, you know, in our process, you know, sharing our experiences internationally, is that there should be oversight mechanism as well, whether it be independent or whether it be internally. It needs to have an oversight mechanisms where the legislature, the public can also see that this office, which functions directly with the legislature, is able to be held accountable, and when mechanisms are put in place to ensure that accountability comes through, because at the end of the day, you know, you want the entity to deliver in its mandate, but also we protect it from any undue influence in that regard. So I think, Chair, these are some of the points I want to bring them in, and I will continue to participate in the process and just listen and give inputs wherever we're required to do. Thank you so much, Chairperson and all members. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jantjies. Let me give it over now to Honorable Nkondlo.
Thank you, Chairperson. Mine, I've been listening to the presentations, although at some point I would get disconnected. So I may have missed some of the inputs. But I just wanted to also appreciate the presentations and also my questions, if maybe further clarity can be provided on three areas. Actually four. One, I saw in the initial presentation that was just giving us the historical background and purpose. It indicated that the entire process started around 2016. Now, I'm interested to know, just from a process point of view, what would have been, you know, the reasons, you know, of this process. I mean, taking so that much time from 2016 to date, and I'm raising, as I indicated earlier on, that in the Western Cape, I think we started late after a lot of lobbying around this matter, especially us sitting in the official opposition benches. So it was the late the end actually of the last administration, we managed to get consensus in the House about, initiating this particular process. So that is why it's a matter that is still on the table, and I'm looking at time because I wanted to understand what would be some of the turnaround times, to realize this instrument. The second one is around how effective. I saw that there is also a relation on case studies, the Gauteng, and also in the other countries. In relation to that, can I just check in terms of the kind of multi-party democracy that we have, what then, becomes the probability, of effectiveness of this particular instrument in such an environment? And again, how do you protect it, from the party politics, thereof, where sometimes you may find that, the engagement about, a particular a budget issue that may be important, but depending on the various persuasions of the different parties, you may find that the actual consideration may be watered down or amplified depending what the different parties are viewing. So I'm interested in understanding those dynamics in as far as effectiveness of the instrument, and whether is there a particular case study that have demonstrated between the legislature and the executive, because one thing I think we learn about, the Westminster system is the fact that, in some of the studies that one has actually considered is how the power dynamics between the legislative arm and the executive, which sometimes power in a Westminster system seems to be skewed to the executive. And I'm saying now your treasuries in terms of the deciding and, factor in terms of public finance. So I'm saying, are there case studies that demonstrate that this particular instrument of the money bill procedure does actually help, in tilting that balance of power and influence of the legislature, in terms of the actual decisions regarding budget? And then I think I'm not going to spend much on the public participation because Dr. Jantjies have raised that, because I think it's one other issue of the extent to which public participation is made effective, especially in terms of the time, because sometimes I see it as a very hurried process, even for ourselves as the legislatures, that, you do not have much time to engage in budget. So now how do you deal with that, especially given, the realities, which I listened, I think also to the presenter about language issues in the context of the Eastern Cape. You have to take into cognizance of all those issues, including how do we lessen the sophistication that is always there in terms of budget, for an ordinary person on the ground. So I'm just going to leave it there for now. If I can, maybe some of the issues were clarified, but I think those are things that I would like to learn also in trying to continue our own lobbying from our side, from the Western Cape legislature, because we really need, and I'm happy that I think the Eastern Cape is also following Gauteng, because now we'll have at least a baseline to say there are already two legislatures that, are ahead in terms of the process. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mkondlo. Now we shall have the Advocate Beja and perhaps Dr. Myataza. But I would like to have, because the two, Dr. Myataza and Advocate Beja, will zoom into the process going forward. Yes, they will touch some of the matters that have been raised here and there, but I would like to have just two members from our ad hoc committee briefly to just unpack some of the little matters. Honorable Camelio Benjamin, I would like you to say something, just 1 minute. Honorable Odendal, I would like to have also 1 minute to say something, because there's also an issue of multi-party effectiveness and some perhaps influences that you may have, you know. Let's have these two, Advocate, Honorable Benji and Honorable Odendaal.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. And I was hoping that the doc would also come back that presented on peers. I'm not sure if he has been reconnected on the line, because some of the clarity questions was those of the division of the revenue bill versus it to be integrated into our actual draft copy. But also what Honorable Luana was saying, depending versus the NCOP's division of finances to our specific province chair. But let me come back to what the honorable member was saying now of the Western Cape chair. I don't think party politics should play anything onto this money bill, because if you look at what Sams was saying and the example that she made, for the emergency fund context to be clearly included, it would assist us if we have a proper legislation to make viaments, because as it stands, as a province, we don't really have the proper bill to actually do that. And I think the process is that, although I found the process when I came in, that is exactly what the province is trying to establish, to make sure that we do have a proper context of being able to do viaments within the province, because it's not an easy thing, especially, Chair, that and the second presenter was correct. Maybe we are over legislated, and some of the legislation that we do is actually tying our own hands. So in answering also the process, why so long, it is not an easy process to have legislation put in place, because you need to interact with so many things that is already there, but also how the new legislation will affect the actual committees that are there. Exactly what was said as to, will this then be, after the legislation has passed, an independent committee and or an internal committee, although it should have its independence. So I think, Chair, it is really for the benefit of a legislator that there should be a proper legislative document to guide us on both, not outside of the MFMA and PFMA and or the national legislation, but to actually be able to be compliant, but also to be able to do what we should do when it is a need for viament. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, for the chance to give me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honorable Camillo Benjamin. Before I give over to Honorable Odendaal, let us catch Dr. Muller. I'm told he's back. I've also looked at the attendance here. I've seen him. Dr. Muller.
Thank you, Chairperson, and apologies. It seems that when I try to turn on my camera, I get disconnected. So if it's all right, I'm just going to answer orally rather than with the camera on. So I did actually hear pretty much everything that's been said, including the questions from the honourable members. So I'll address those as requested. Honourable Benjamin asked about the integrating of the division of revenue process, and also about the issue pertaining to the internal unit and the legislation in that regard. And then Honourable Luana also asked about division of revenue and then issues around zero-based budgeting and tension with the executive. So let me start with the division of revenue matter. So just to repeat, really, the point I was making there is that the division of revenue mandating, strictly speaking, is part of the provincial legislature's public finance oversight process. As I mentioned, the Gauteng Act failed to incorporate that into their legislation, and that in the future, there are situations, there are scenarios in which that could lead to contradictions between the legislature's mandating process and its actual money bills process internally within the legislature. So the proposal is to ensure that those are integrated. And I think the advantage of that, well, there are two advantages. The one is that it addresses, it will ensure that those kinds of scenarios don't arise where there's some kind of contradiction between the mandating process and the corresponding process at the national level and the internal provincial legislature process dealing with its fiscal framework and appropriations bill. But the second advantage of it is that it will focus attention on the timing of the process. And it may even require some engagement with the national legislature, because as things stand, the problem is that the national legislature determines the time periods by which the Division of Revenue bill is processed, and therefore also the mandating period. But that mandating period has an impact on the provincial legislature's processes and time available to deal with certain matters. And to date, our impression from the research is that this hasn't really been resolved. What's happened is that in a number of provincial legislatures, the mandating process happens in parallel to processing of the provincial budget documents in a way that wouldn't actually be consistent if one were to have an impact on the other. So this legislation is an opportunity to figure that out and resolve it once and for all by ensuring that the processes are integrated and that the timelines are consistent. So that's what I'm proposing, and I'm happy to put together a specific proposal if that would be useful for the committee. But I think it might also be something that the committee staff would be able to do. So at this point, I just wanted to draw attention to the critical necessity of doing that, and I'm happy to be of further assistance if that would be useful. On the matter of the provincial legislature budget unit, I mean, I'd largely echo the remarks made by my colleagues at PSAM and also my former colleague Dr. Jantjies at the Parliamentary Budget Office. You know, Dr. Jantjies made the point that it really depends what kind of what do honourable members, does the legislature want from this institution. And Honourable Benjamin was referring to the issue of independence. As I say, I don't have a strong view about this, partly because I don't feel like I have enough information on how the provincial legislature operates internally. But I do think that there is a good case to be made for an independent office. And in that case, essentially what I'm saying is that the legislation should be drafted accordingly. So and there are resources that can be drawn on here. Besides the international literature, there were some quite detailed discussions that happened, in particular when the National Money Bills Act was amended to strengthen the independence of the National Parliamentary Budget Office. So issues around the transfer of funds, the appointment of the director, the requirements of the director, the requirements of staff, the information access powers, which is something that we haven't spoken about. But for example, at the national level, there was a slightly cumbersome process whereby the office had to get committee chairpersons to sign off on information requests, and that slowed things down, but in certain circumstances could also compromise the functioning of the office. And so standard and good international practice is to give the office its own information access powers. And this talks to the issue that Honourable Luana raised about possible tensions with the executive. You know, an office of this kind should really be able to request information directly from the executive, whether it's from the Treasury or whether, for example, it's from a given provincial department, rather than having to try and go through the committees in order to do that, because after all, the office is serving the committees anyway. So there are a number of such things that are good practice for independent offices, and if that is the decision that the honourable members make, the ad hoc committee makes, and is approved by the legislature, then my recommendation would be to to integrate those principles into the legislation, because a high-level principle as well is that these things must be made explicit, regardless of the good intentions of honourable members. But in future parliaments, there may not be the same good intentions, and so the point with these independent institutions is to insulate them from undue interference in their operations. And so the more explicit and detailed the legislation is, the better, if that's the route that the honourable members decide to go. There was another question. Oh, and to just speak directly to the question of tension with the executive. I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but it's certainly the case that sometimes there is tension between, in other countries in particular, it's been less of an issue in South Africa to date. But in other countries, there have been tensions between the executive and these officers, and usually for good reasons, I must say, honourable members, because the point is that in many countries, not just in South Africa, the executive has a lot more capacity and a lot more authority, effectively, than legislatures in practice. And so when one introduces this kind of legislation and the associated capacity to back it up through an independent office, such offices can produce research that is inconvenient for the executive, because it perhaps shows that the arguments that they made for a particular decision were not sufficiently justified, or it supports members in proposing an amendment. And the truth is, honourable members, that around the world, the executive is never happy to have its budget proposals amended. So necessarily, I'm sure honourable members are aware of this dynamic. And so when an office provides the kind of support to facilitate such an amendment, then the executive often isn't happy. But I think honourable members will know that, given that's your role, that is the purpose of legislatures ultimately, is to hold the executive to account, and the executive will not always be happy about that. So I hope that addresses that question. And then I think that also touches on Honourable Nkondlo's question about case studies, whether the legislation tilts the balance and affects actual decisions. Certainly in other countries, it has done so, legislation and the roles of these particular kinds of officers. Excuse me. But in the South African context, as I believe the honourable member was also alluding to, the political dynamics are important, and so it can partly depend on whether the majority party in the legislature is willing to make an amendment of a budget tabled by the executive that is also of the majority party. In other instances, perhaps a situation that could become likely, almost happened in Gauteng, is the possibility of coalitions. And in a coalition situation, it's even more likely that the legislature may want to make amendments to a budget proposed by the executive. So there are political dynamics that matter, but the point is that one needs to have the legislation and the capacity in place in order that when there is the desire to make an amendment, it can be properly processed and done in the public interest. The final point the final question I wanted to address was Honourable Luana's question about zero-based budgeting. It's a very interesting point. Just as a background, and I know my colleagues at PSAM will also be aware of this, it's interesting that zero-based budgeting was something that's been proposed by civil society, progressive civil society organizations for some time, and the Treasury was quite resistant to it. My view is that was because if zero-based budgeting had been adopted, there would have been a realization about the extent of resources required for various areas of service delivery, well beyond what was actually provided for. And I think maybe the Treasury was concerned that would put undue pressure on the fiscus. So the Treasury was actually quite resistant to zero-based budgeting in the past, and it's interesting that that's now changed. But in the current context, the appetite from the National Treasury for zero-based budgeting is more in order to cut budgets rather than increase them, which was the objective of society previously. So I think that's an important nuance. But But I would say that in linking it to this legislation, that's certainly very important, because what I think we're going to see, given the current state of public finances, is potentially some significant cuts to very important service delivery areas. And I think the more capacity the legislature has to engage with such proposals, the better. And unfortunately, it will take time to set up the kind of office or unit that's envisaged. But certainly, the issue of zero-based budgeting, I think, that Honourable Luana raises is just provides further motivation for the importance of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muller. Honourable Benji, someone has unmuted your mic. Thank you, Dr. Muller, for your response. Let us now take for Honorable Odendaal. A question has been raised by Honorable Nkondlo on the political dynamics. They are sitting, she is part of those members that are sitting on the opposition desks. Now, as one of us, how do you see the legislature handling matters in this process of establishing this piece of legislation, noting that you and other honorable members that are part of this committee are also sitting in the opposition desk? Is there anything that you feel? Just 1 minute, Honorable Odendaal.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think my contribution, first of all, I just want to say that obviously the aim of drafting this bill is to ensure that we have something that is of use to the province. And therefore, it would be important for us to ensure that we incorporate international best practice in this in our bill, so that when we enact this, we have something that adds value and really gives us what is needed. And I want to give some background to what I'm saying here. We have some very valuable input here, and I think we as a committee needs to possibly have a meeting as soon as possible hereafter to discuss some of the input that we've received. Because my biggest concern that I've always had with provincial treasury is that if you look at the political powers that serves on the committee, we all support mostly support the MEC, and we support Treasury, and we want to see Treasury having far more powers than what they have, because they can make the recommendations, they can try and assist the various directorates and the various departments, but unfortunately, because they've got no teeth, very often the good advices from provincial treasury is just ignored. So I'm saying this, that when we are establishing the provincial legislature budget unit, or whatever we're going to call it eventually, that a unit or office must have the necessary teeth. And if it's not going to have the necessary teeth, then we are fooling ourselves and we are wasting our time. So I think the input that we've received, very valuable, but we ourselves has to maybe just have a real look at what we actually envisage, how this is going to work, and how we have made sure that that unit is going to ultimately have the fleeting powers that we want it to have in order to get the province going in the right direction when it comes to financial sustainability and budgeting processes are concerned. That said, I think that we still have a bit of work, and I think just to end off by saying I agree that this is bigger than there should be political party unity when it comes to this process, because it really would be in the best interest of all our residents if we can get it right. And I just then finally want to end off by saying thank you to Advocate Beja and for the work that she's put in. She has really put a lot of hard work in this, and I think if we can just tie all the input that we've received together and deal with those one or two critical issues as to how do we ensure that we give this unit the necessary powers so that it can do in the future what we want it to do. I think that's sort of like all I want to say. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Odendal. Before I give over to Advocate Beja and Dr. Miataza, I would like to indicate that these documents, the copies of the draft bills, we do have them in our languages as per the language policy of the legislature. We have copies in isiXhosa, copies in English, Sesotho, as well as in Afrikaans. Those are our dominant languages in the province. So we have 4. Even when we dealt with our public participation, we use the local radio stations. We'll use Umhlobo Wenene, it's a national radio station, but also the community radio stations. And we have been using local languages in those radio stations. Just add a few things in English or the heading, but the actual presentation, we do them in isiXhosa and some isiSotho with some flavor of Afrikaans and, you know, so the language is taken care of. Also, the composition of the ad hoc committee itself, as I've indicated, Honorable Retief Odendal is coming from the opposition party, Honorable Dayal from the opposition party, then the other members, members of the executive of the legislature apart, some chairpersons of committees, especially the chairpersons of the Finance Portfolio Committee is here with us, Honorable Luana. Even when we go out to represent the province externally in other countries, we go out as a contingent comprising of all these parties that are here in the legislature. So our multi-party effectiveness is really assisting us because they are able to raise matters in the meeting. Then when we go out as a team from the legislature, talking in one voice, we reading from one page, same page, the speaker's notes is the same and everything. So it is really assisting us, the composition itself. Also the consultations that we have done before within the legislature, the members of the legislature, Office of the Premier, Provincial Treasury, the institutions of higher learning and PSAM, and so on and so on. So we are trying by all means. There's also a document. I think after these questions, we'll look at how do we structure it, the issue of the stakeholders, because in our working document, we have the list of stakeholders that we are consulting. And those stakeholders are the ones that are expected to make presentations and submissions to the ad hoc committee on money bills. Others were calling Dr. Myataza, calling Advocate Beja, and even calling me as individuals, inquiring about their inputs. They have listened to the radios. They have seen us presenting, even on the on TV. So everyone in the province is aware of what we are doing, and we have also requested the leaders of the district development model that are representatives from the legislature working in the various districts throughout the province to present the requests for public participation, comments, and all that. So even SALGA as that body esebenzisana nomasipala, SALGA is talking to the municipalities, distributing information. They are also making their own inputs on the piece of legislation. But let me now give over to our team, Advocate Beja and your team. I'm happy that also Advocate Njitumbu is here. Advocate Beja and Dr. Myataza, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Doc will start, then I'll come in late after him.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chairperson. If I may, I don't think there is much that I will be saying, just to appreciate that is the inputs that have been made, that is from the various stakeholders. I would like to say we have started, that is the committee has started, that is incorporating some of these. But much as we are going to make these changes, one, we cannot run away from the fact that the section 120 subsection 3, it puts emphasis that is a legislature must provide a procedure. Now that is in provisioning or in providing that procedure, one cannot run away from being or seeming to be technical or rather operational in the way one approaches the bill and also the responses. So I would say we do appreciate that is the ones that is on the consideration of the division of revenue process. Those time frames, even that is at the onset, that is when we're drafting, that is at the onset of the drafting of the bill, we did make that is some of the implications would be that the legislature may have maybe to extend its legislature program by 1 week, that is before closing, or 1 week, that is before the normal opening of parliament, that is to incorporate, that is the time frames which we have there. And then on the one on the division of revenue, yes, that process usually takes place, that is in March, in April, May, when it comes to the provinces. And then the consideration of the provincial appropriation bill itself, it's usually that is the May, June period. But we will try, that is in the bill, that is to align those as much as we can. And also more so is that we're also having currently, that is an interaction with the FFC, because much as the FFC provides, that is, it makes some recommendations on the division of revenue, that is the national one. We were consulting with them to see whether can they also not maybe provide some comments on our own provincial budget, maybe as introduced even during that is the MTBS. So that is also going to try and factor that into the process, that is aligning that is our provincial appropriation with the division of revenue, and also bringing also some of the bodies, the institutions which are constitutional, that is like the FFC. And then coming to the question of the PBO, I think what Dr. Jantjies did mention, that is context becomes important there. Maybe that we will also be considering, because one has got to look, that is in structuring the PBO, that is its independence or it being an internal unit, or maybe, if possible, thinking of maybe of a hybrid structure where you may have, that is the budget committee itself recommending, let's say, the director of the PBO and that is of the PBO, but you find that it's the secretary or the internal units of the legislature that assist in the appointment process and all things like that. That we will have to look into. And also bearing in mind that even the size of the PBO itself also in a way depends, let's say, on the appetite of the legislature or on the resources of the legislature to staff it as much as it can. But I'm just trying to highlight that is the question of the context. But I will not go much into that. And then on the other one, we do appreciate that is the part on the demands on the legislature itself, which seem to be maybe more than those of the Treasury itself that is coming from the bill. That will be considered. I can say that as an example, I can say that is in our bill currently in the consideration of the BRRRs. We have a section there that is maybe where we mention that SCOPA must consider, that is all the departments, must call all the departments for hearings. Maybe that may be too much for the legislature, but those are things which we will be considering. And also coming to in fact, tying this with the context, I think we've got a section there in the bill where we say there must be cooperation that is between the PBO and the other structures which are in the legislature, for instance, that is the research unit. So that is what comes through the research unit of the legislature gets incorporated or gets into the PBO. That is the portfolio committees. Now there is interaction between the portfolio committees and the budget committees. I think those are some of the things that I would like to mention, but we'll really look into the inputs and also factor them now that is on the way forward, as was covered by that is Honorable Odendaal when he said that is the committee may have to meet, that is very soon, that is to factor in. I think that's what I've got to say at the moment without being too technical or too detailed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Doc. Advocate Beja.
Thank you, Chair. And good morning to you, the members and our valued stakeholders and the guests from the Western Cape Parliament and our colleague from National Parliament. Good morning. And thank you so much for the presentations. We had been walking this journey behind the scenes with you on behalf of the committee, of course. Just maybe one or 2 points for me in relation to because we would still need, we were in fact already in the process of responding to some of the submissions. Just on the issue of public participation, Chair, I think that money bills, just like any other piece of legislation, the requirement on the part of the legislatures to facilitate public involvement stems from the Constitution. So for me, Chairperson and honorable members, the money bills, like I'm saying, just like any other piece of legislation, the legislature is aware that in terms of Section 118, it is required to facilitate public involvement. And as we are all familiar with the processes of public involvement or facilitating public involvement, it varies from case to case. And as my colleagues from SAM in their substantive presentation or submission had referred to the Doctors for Life judgment, in that same judgment, the Judge Ngcobo had written for the majority, had also came out clearly that as the judiciary, they would not at any point tell the legislature how to conduct public participation. But I think what we all need to take comfort from is that the Constitution requires of the legislature in Section 118 to facilitate public involvement, which is what the committee is currently engaged in. So money bills, just like any other pieces of legislation that gets tabled in the legislature, the committee would then have to demonstrate that what is required of Section 118 has been done. There has been a facilitation of public involvement. And our standing rules, in addition to what the Constitution requires, details how the steps that the legislature should take to ensure that it facilitates public involvement. Then maybe on the issue of, we take note of the issue on with respect to Section 25 of the PFMA, the use of funds in emergency situations. I think the committee we will consider the submission, Chair, and respond to it. But without going into much detail, I think if you look at subsection 6 of that section, it requires that, remember, the funds are being used in an emergency situation, meaning that if the funds would not be utilized, there would be serious prejudice to the public interest in the province. But there's a safeguard built into that Section 25 of the PFMA, which is subsection 6, which then requires that the expenditure that would have been done utilizing subsection 1 must then be included in the next provincial adjustment budget, which would then have to be tabled in the provincial legislature and be interrogated by the provincial legislature. And additional to that, subsection 4 requires that a report, 4 and 5 require that a report on the expenditure that would have been done in terms of subsection 1 must be tabled in the provincial legislature. So I think the bill refers to adjustment budgets already. So the requirement in subsection 6 that the expenditure that would have been made in an emergency situation utilizing subsection 1 of Section 25 of the PFMA must be included in the adjustment budget that would then be tabled in the legislature and ultimately be presented before the budget committee. But we will respond in detail when we then prepare the responses for the committee. I think my colleague has reflected on the budget office and our ideas around that budget office. I think honorable members and colleagues, having learned from the experience from other legislatures and from other countries, we are mindful of the fact that there are areas relating to the establishment of the PBO that we would need to be explicit on in the enabling legislation itself to ensure that the independence that that office ought to have is not lost. But without really providing that much of a detail, I think Dr. Jantjies and Dr. Myataza reflected on this, that whilst the independence of the PBO is what is of paramount importance, for us, it's not mainly or about the location or the appointment as an HR function of staff of the PBO. What is key for us is that the independence and the support, rather the support that would be provided by the PBO is reflective of its independence. So the advice, the technical analysis, and that the PBO would be rendering to the legislature and to the committee that it would be supporting should then reflect its independence more than its location or who gets to appoint the staff members to the PBO. But we take note of the comments and the suggestions from the colleagues, and we will then consider them as we begin the process of formally responding to all the submissions. I think I'll end it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Beja. Honorable members, A part of the responses and input from Advocate Beja were also giving us the progress going forward. As also the matters that have been highlighted by Dr. Miataza are also part of our way forward. Now, let me take this opportunity to thank everyone that has made time to attend this historic public hearing. Dr. Jantis, you go back to the National Parliament with our praise to say the National Parliament is committed by yourself to support, to appreciate what the provincial legislature of the Eastern Cape is doing, and also the commitment that you have blessed with us. We really appreciate that. Ms. Msindo and Ms. Mutudi, together with Dr. Muller, your presentations equally. You are saying this is long overdue development of the section 120 subsection 3 of the Constitution. And this is giving a legislature an opportunity to capacitate itself and have the power to interrogate, the power to interact. Ms. Mutudi is even saying, no, on that clause 5, we should at least not say the committee would examine. You say we'll consider. You know, that is acceptable. Your inputs and submissions, presentations, you have just on their own, they have given us support. They have given us commitment. They have made us to be more vigilant because they are thought-provoking presentations made to the legislature committee. And the main areas of inputs and key considerations we have noted as the committee members, and this will lead us to have a polished final product that will be presented to the House when we meet again in the House. Honorable Kondlo, your presentation was outstanding as a member. So even in my records here, I've noted that the members that are present here is Honorable Kondlo, Honorable Benji, Honorable Luana, Honorable Filtani, Honorable Dayal, Honorable Odendal, Honorable Pongo, and Honorable Nkopani. So we are a big team. We would like to work with the Western Cape, because when you say you will have now the Gauteng Provincial Legislature as well as the Eastern Cape for your base line to check on how did we go this route to get to where we are now. We are also committing ourselves as the legislature to assist you where we can. We'll participate where you request us to do so. So you are all appreciated, honorable members. The members of the House in the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature, without you, this couldn't have been a success. It has been. Welcome the verbal or the oral presentations. We welcome all the ideas that have been put forward on this very important day. Thank you very much, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair.
The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Chairperson.
Honorable Chair. Thank you, honorable members. A good day to you all.
Thank you, members.
Thank you.
Good chair.
Thank you, Honorable Luana. Ngabe sikukhapha ke Menkondlo to go back to Cape Town and also give you some provision, you know, coming from far away as members, but bon voyage.